Thank
The
you.
moment Marcus Williams stepped onto Flight 447 from Denver to Atlanta, every conversation in the cabin fell silent. Not because of who he was, but because of who he appeared to be. The stench hit first, a mixture of unwashed clothes, old leather boots, and the kind of desperation that clings to a man who hasn't seen a real bed in months. Passengers instinctively covered their noses with magazines, scarves, anything they could find, while children buried their faces in their mother's shoulders. What they didn't know was that this disheveled, broken-looking man had once been the most decorated helicopter pilot in his unit, a hero who had saved dozens of lives in Afghanistan. But that was before everything fell apart. Sarah Chen noticed him immediately as he shuffled down the narrow aisle, his weathered military duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. At 26, she had been working as a flight attendant for Delta Airlines for 3 years, long enough to have seen every type of passenger imaginable. But something about this man's posture, the way he carried himself like he was apologizing for existing, made her heart clench with unexpected sympathy. If you're moved by stories of human compassion, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The other passengers weren't nearly as kind. A woman in a designer suit audibly gasped and pulled her Hermes purse closer to her chest as Marcus passed her row. "This is exactly why I usually fly first class," she whispered loudly to her companion, making no effort to lower her voice. "They'll let anyone on these planes now." Behind her, a businessman in a crisp blue shirt rolled his eyes and muttered something about security standards going downhill. Even the teenagers in row 12 couldn't help but giggle and point, their phones already out, probably preparing to capture what they assumed would be an entertaining flight story for their social media feeds.
Marcus heard every word, felt every stare, absorbed every grimace of disgust, like physical blows to his already battered soul. His seat assignment was 23C, middle seat in economy, wedged between a college student who immediately put on oversized headphones and turned toward the window, and a middle-aged man who took one look at Marcus and suddenly became very interested in upgrading to business class. The flight was completely booked, though, so the man was stuck, breathing through his mouth and periodically spraying himself with cologne, as if Marcus's mere presence was contaminating the air around him. As Marcus settled into his seat, trying to make himself as small as possible, the whispers grew louder. "Someone should complain to the flight crew," suggested a woman 3 rows back. "This is completely unacceptable for a commercial flight." Another passenger chimed in. "I paid good money for this ticket. I shouldn't have to smell that for the next 4 hours." The comments cut deep, each one a reminder of how far he had fallen from the man he used to be. Just 18 months ago, he had been Captain Marcus Williams, respected by his peers, trusted with million-dollar aircraft and precious human cargo. Now, he was just another homeless veteran that society preferred to pretend didn't exist. Sarah watched the entire scene unfold from the galley, her heart breaking a little more with each cruel comment. She had noticed how the man's hands trembled slightly as he buckled his seatbelt, how he kept his eyes downcast even when people were openly staring at him, how he seemed to be trying to disappear into himself. There was something about his bearing, despite his obvious struggles, that suggested dignity buried beneath layers of hardship and pain. While her colleagues busied themselves with pre-flight preparations, making subtle gestures and exchanged glances about the situation in 23C, Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives forever.
She approached his row with a bottle of water and a gentle smile, kneeling in the aisle beside his seat so they would be at eye level. The simple gesture immediately caught the attention of nearby passengers who watched with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said softly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of settling passengers and overhead bin compartment slamming shut. "I'm Sarah, one of your flight attendants today. I wanted to personally welcome you aboard and see if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable." Marcus looked up for the first time since boarding, and Sarah was struck by his eyes. They were deep brown, weathered by experiences she could only imagine, but there was an intelligence there, a kindness that hadn't been completely extinguished by whatever circumstances had brought him to this point. For a moment he seemed unable to speak, as if he had forgotten that people could address him with basic human decency. When he finally found his voice, it was barely above a whisper. "No, ma'am, I'm fine. Thank you for asking." But Sarah didn't move away. Instead, she held out the bottle of water with a smile that reached her eyes. "Please, take this. And if you need anything during the flight, anything at all, don't hesitate to press your call button or find me in the galley. That's what I'm here for." The college student beside Marcus pulled one headphone off his ear, suddenly interested in the interaction, while the businessman on the other side shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could escape the situation entirely. The simple act of kindness hit Marcus like a physical force. When was the last time someone had spoken to him without judgment, without immediately assuming the worst about his character based on his appearance? When was the last time anyone had called him sir or offered him something without expecting anything in return? His throat tightened, and he had to blink several times to keep tears from forming in his eyes. "Thank you," he managed, accepting the water bottle with hands that shook slightly. "That's very kind of you." What happened next surprised everyone in the surrounding rows. Sarah didn't just smile politely and walk away as they expected. Instead, she lingered for a moment, her expression genuinely concerned. "Have you eaten anything today?" she asked quietly. Her question meant only for Marcus, but audible to the passengers who were now openly listening to the conversation. The businessman beside Marcus made an exaggerated show of checking his watch, clearly annoyed by what he perceived as unnecessary attention being paid to someone he considered unworthy of it. Marcus shook his head almost imperceptibly. He hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days, surviving on whatever he could find in dumpsters behind fast food restaurants, or the occasional handout from someone kind enough to spare $1. But he wasn't about to admit that to this young woman who was already being far kinder than he deserved. "I'm okay," he said again. But the lie was obvious in the way his stomach chose that exact moment to emit a low, rumbling growl that several passengers couldn't help but hear. Sarah's heart broke a little more. Without saying another word, she stood and walked back to the galley, returning a few minutes later with a small tray that she placed on Marcus's lap. It held a turkey sandwich, a bag of chips, an apple, and another bottle of water. "This is our crew meal," she said simply, "but I already ate earlier. I hate to see food go to waste." It was a lie, of course. She was giving up her own lunch, but she delivered it so naturally that Marcus almost believed her story about waste prevention. The passengers around them watched this exchange with a mixture of emotions. Some seemed genuinely moved by Sarah's compassion, nodding approvingly and whispering to their companions about that sweet flight attendant. Others appeared confused or even annoyed, as if kindness to someone they deemed unworthy somehow diminished their own experience. The woman in the designer suit made another loud comment about bleeding hearts and enabling behavior, but her voice lacked some of its earlier conviction, as if Sarah's actions had introduced a note of uncertainty into her rigid worldview. What viewers would soon discover is that pause to think about what you would do in Sarah's situation. Would you show the same compassion, or would you look the other way like most passengers? Leave us a comment below. Marcus was not just any homeless veteran struggling with the aftermath of war. He was carrying secrets that would soon come to light in the most unexpected way. Secrets that would transform not only how everyone on that plane saw him, but how they saw themselves and their own capacity for both judgment and grace. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Sarah continued her pre-flight duties, but she found herself glancing toward row 23 more frequently than usual. She watched Marcus eat the sandwich slowly, savoring each bite, as if he were tasting food for the first time in years, which, in many ways, he was. Real food, giving freely, without strings attached or hidden agendas. It was a luxury he had almost forgotten existed. The simple act of eating seemed to restore some color to his pale complexion, and Sarah felt a warm satisfaction knowing she had played a small part in that transformation. But it wasn't just the food that was affecting Marcus. It was the way Sarah had looked at him. Not through him, not around him, not with the mixture of fear and disgust that had become his daily reality, but at him, as if he were a human being worthy of consideration and care. The feeling was both wonderful and terrifying. Wonderful because it reminded him of who he used to be, of a time when he had value and purpose and people who depended on him. Terrifying because he had learned to insulate himself from hope, having been disappointed too many times by promises that turned out to be empty, and help that came with conditions he couldn't meet. As Marcus slowly ate the sandwich, memories began flooding back unbidden. He remembered the weight of his flight helmet, the familiar vibration of rotor blades cutting through Afghan air, the faces of young soldiers who looked at him with trust and hope when he arrived to extract them from impossible situations. He remembered the pride in his mother's eyes when he graduated from flight school, the respect of his fellow pilots, the sense of purpose that had driven him through the most dangerous missions of his career. All of that felt like another lifetime now, belonging to someone else entirely. The transformation from war hero to homeless veteran hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual descent that began with his final deployment, a mission that went catastrophically wrong despite his best efforts. He had managed to save most of his crew, but 2 young soldiers, barely 19 years old, had died in the crash that followed. The official investigation cleared him of any wrongdoing, but Marcus had never been able to forgive himself for the lives he couldn't save. The nightmares started immediately, followed by insomnia, panic attacks, and a growing dependence on alcohol to numb the pain that seemed to live in his bones. His wife, Jennifer, had tried to help at first. She had arranged counseling appointments, researched PTSD treatments, and stood by him through the worst of his episodes. But Marcus had been too proud, too stubborn, too convinced that he should be able to handle his problems alone. Real pilots, he told himself, didn't break down over things that were part of the job. Real men didn't cry in their sleep or jump at sudden noises or see the faces of dead soldiers in every crowd. The marriage crumbled slowly, then all at once. Jennifer left on a Tuesday morning in October, taking their 7-year-old daughter Emma with her. The note she left behind was kind but final. She couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore, and she couldn't let Emma grow up thinking that Daddy's behavior was normal or acceptable. The house felt impossibly empty without Emma's laughter echoing through the rooms, without Jennifer's patient attempts to draw him back into the world of the living. Without his family to anchor him, Marcus's descent accelerated. He lost his civilian job as a helicopter pilot for a medical transport company after showing up to work intoxicated one too many times. The VA benefits helped for a while, but navigating the bureaucracy while battling depression and PTSD proved nearly impossible. He moved from the family home to a small apartment, then to an even smaller efficiency, then to weekly motels that charged by the day and asked no questions about employment or references.
The final blow came when he learned that Jennifer had filed for divorce and was requesting sole custody of Emma. She had documentation of his drinking, police reports from domestic disturbance calls when neighbors complained about his screaming nightmares, and testimony from Emma's teachers about concerning things their daughter had said about home life. Marcus didn't contest the divorce or fight for custody. How could he, when he could barely take care of himself? But losing legal access to his daughter felt like losing the last piece of his identity that mattered. From there, it was a short fall to the streets. The modest savings from his military service and civilian job dried up quickly when every day required enough alcohol to keep the nightmares at bay. He learned the rhythms of homeless life. Which shelters opened when, which soup kitchens served meals on which days, which police officers would move you along with a warning versus which ones would arrest you for vagrancy. He learned to sleep with one eye open, to keep his few remaining possessions hidden or strapped to his body, to trust no one and expect nothing. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold or even the constant fear. It was the invisibility. People looked right through him as if he didn't exist, as if his very presence was an inconvenience that disrupted their ordered view of the world. Store clerks followed him suspiciously. Restaurant owners called the police when he lingered too long near their establishments. Children pointed and stared until their parents pulled them away with warnings about those kinds of people. He had been living this way for over a year when he managed to scrape together enough money for the plane ticket to Atlanta. The ticket had cost him nearly everything he had, but there was a job lead there, a friend from his military days who owned a small charter flight company and had promised Marcus a chance if he could get himself to Georgia. It was his last hope, his final attempt at clawing his way back to something resembling a normal life. But by the time he boarded Flight 447, Marcus had almost given up hope that the job would work out. He looked and smelled like what he was, a man living rough, a person that society had discarded. Who was going to hire him to fly expensive aircraft when he couldn't even afford a shower or a clean shirt? The business card with his friend's contact information felt increasingly like a cruel joke, a reminder of how far he had fallen rather than a genuine opportunity for redemption. That was his state of mind when Sarah first approached him, hopeless, resigned to failure, convinced that he was beyond help or salvation, which made her kindness all the more shocking and transformative. Here was someone who didn't know his story, didn't owe him anything, had no reason to see him as anything more than a problem to be managed or ignored. And yet she had chosen to treat him with dignity and compassion, as if his comfort and well-being actually mattered to someone in the world. The effect was profound and immediate. For the first time in months, Marcus felt a flicker of the man he used to be, not the war hero that others would soon discover, but simply a human being worthy of basic kindness and respect. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten existed, and it awakened something in him that had been dormant for far too long. The possibility that his story might not be over, that redemption might still be possible, even for someone who had fallen as far as he had.
During the flight, Sarah made several more trips past Marcus's row, always finding small reasons to check on him. She brought him a pillow when she noticed him trying to rest his head against the window. She offered him a blanket when the cabin temperature dropped. Each time, she spoke to him with the same warm professionalism she showed to every passenger, but there was something extra in her interactions with him, a gentleness that went beyond standard customer service training. What Sarah didn't know was that her actions were being noticed not just by Marcus, but by other crew members as well. Her colleague Jennifer, a veteran flight attendant with 15 years of experience, pulled her aside during a quiet moment in the galley. "Sarah, honey, I admire what you're doing," Jennifer said quietly, glancing toward Marcus's seat. "But you need to be careful. Management doesn't like it when we show too much individual attention to challenging passengers. It can create problems." Sarah understood the warning, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. Something about Marcus called to her protective instincts in a way that went beyond professional duty. Maybe it was the way he never complained, never demanded anything, never made her feel like her kindness was expected or owed. Maybe it was the glimpses she caught of intelligence and dignity beneath his rough exterior. Or maybe it was simply that her heart recognized pain when she saw it, and everything in her nature rebelled against walking past someone who was clearly suffering. "I hear you, Jen," Sarah replied, "but I can't just pretend he doesn't exist. He's not causing any trouble. He's just hurting. And if showing him basic human decency is against policy, then maybe the policy needs to change." Jennifer sighed and patted Sarah's arm affectionately, recognizing the stubborn streak that made Sarah such a good flight attendant, but occasionally put her at odds with corporate guidelines. Meanwhile, Marcus was struggling with his own internal conflict. Every act of kindness from Sarah made his heart race with emotions he thought he had buried forever. Not just gratitude, though that was certainly present, but something deeper and more dangerous. The beginning of romantic feelings for this woman who seemed to see past his exterior to something worth caring about. The realization terrified him because it highlighted just how impossible any kind of relationship would be. What could he offer someone like Sarah? He had no home, no job, no prospects beyond the slim hope of employment in Atlanta. He hadn't spoken to his daughter in over a year, had no contact with his ex-wife, owned nothing of value except the memories of who he used to be. Sarah was young, beautiful, clearly kind-hearted and successful, with her whole future ahead of her. The gulf between their circumstances seemed insurmountable, and yet he couldn't stop himself from imagining what it would be like to have someone like her in his life. Someone who looked at him and saw a person worth saving rather than a problem to be solved. The businessman sitting next to him, Robert Carlyle, continued to make his displeasure known through passive-aggressive comments and theatrical displays of discomfort. "This is exactly what's wrong with society today," he muttered to his seatmate across the aisle, apparently not caring that Marcus could hear every word. "We've gotten so politically correct that we can't even address basic hygiene issues on commercial flights. Next thing you know, they'll be seating us next to people with infectious diseases in the name of equality." Marcus felt each comment like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain silent. What was the point of defending himself? Everything the man was saying about his appearance and smell was technically true, even if his assumptions about Marcus's character and worth were completely wrong. Besides, Marcus had learned through hard experience that engaging with people who were determined to see him as subhuman rarely led to anything productive. But Sarah had clearly heard the comments too, and Marcus could see the tension building in her shoulders every time she passed their row. Finally, during one particularly loud complaint about standards and the decline of civilized society, she stopped and addressed the businessman directly. "Sir," she said, her voice carefully controlled, but with an edge that suggested she was holding back stronger feelings, "I understand that everyone wants to be comfortable during their flight, but perhaps we could discuss any concerns you have about your travel experience without making comments about other passengers. Everyone on this aircraft deserves to travel with dignity." Robert bristled at what he perceived as criticism. "Miss, I'm simply expressing legitimate concerns about the conditions I'm being forced to endure. I have every right to voice my displeasure when the service falls below reasonable standards." His voice was getting louder, drawing attention from other passengers who were beginning to turn around to see what was happening. "You absolutely have the right to voice concerns about airline service," Sarah replied evenly. "What you don't have the right to do is make disparaging comments about fellow passengers within their hearing. If you continue to do so, I'll have to ask the captain to address the situation more formally." The exchange created a moment of tense silence in the cabin, with passengers suddenly very interested in pretending they weren't listening while hanging on every word. Marcus wanted to disappear into his seat, mortified that his presence was causing conflict and putting Sarah in a difficult position with a customer. But there was another part of him, a part that had been dormant for so long he had almost forgotten it existed, that felt a surge of gratitude and something that might have been pride at watching this remarkable woman stand up for him. The confrontation might have escalated further if not for the intervention of an unexpected ally. An elderly woman sitting 2 rows behind Marcus, who had been quietly observing the entire situation, suddenly spoke up in a voice that carried clearly through the cabin. "Young man," she said, addressing the businessman with the authority of someone who had lived through 8 decades and seen every variety of human behavior, "I don't know what's troubling you today, but taking it out on someone who's clearly going through a hard time says more about your character than his appearance says about him. Maybe you should spend less time complaining about other people and more time examining why you feel the need to kick someone when they're already down." The rebuke was delivered with such quiet dignity and moral authority that it left Robert speechless. Other passengers began nodding in agreement, and Marcus realized that the tide of opinion in the cabin was slowly shifting. Not everyone supported the businessman's complaints. Not everyone saw Marcus as nothing more than an inconvenience to be tolerated. The elderly woman, whose name was Dorothy, had noticed more than just the obvious dynamics of the situation. She had watched Sarah's interactions with Marcus, had seen the careful way she treated him with respect and kindness, and had observed Marcus's own behavior, how he never complained, never demanded anything, always said please and thank you, and seemed genuinely grateful for every small courtesy. She had also noticed something that others might have missed, the military bearing that was still visible beneath his rough exterior, the way he instinctively straightened when addressed, the respectful manner in which he spoke to Sarah and other crew members. "Honey," Dorothy said, leaning forward to speak directly to Marcus, "I don't know your story, but I can tell you've served our country. My late husband was in the Army for 30 years, and I recognize the posture, the mannerisms. Whatever brought you to this point, I want you to know that some of us still remember that service matters, that sacrifice should be honored, not scorned. Marcus felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the unexpected support from this stranger who had chosen to see past his circumstances to something deeper. "Thank you, ma'am," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." Dorothy smiled and patted his shoulder gently, a gesture so maternal and accepting that it reminded Marcus painfully of his own mother, who had died while he was deployed and whom he had never properly grieved. The incident had an effect that rippled throughout the cabin in ways that would only become fully apparent later. Passengers who had initially recoiled from Marcus began to reconsider their assumptions. A teenage girl who had earlier giggled and pointed with her friends now looked embarrassed and whispered an apology as she passed his row on her way to the bathroom. A mother traveling with young children made eye contact with Marcus and offered a genuine smile, teaching her kids through example that kindness was always the right choice. But perhaps most importantly, the confrontation had clarified something for Sarah that she had been struggling to understand about her own feelings. Watching Marcus endure criticism with such quiet dignity, seeing him accept both cruelty and kindness with equal grace, had awakened something in her that went far beyond professional sympathy or general compassion for someone in need. She was falling for this man, not despite his circumstances, but because of the strength and character he displayed in facing those circumstances with such resilience. Marcus noticed, and despite his best efforts to remain guarded, he found himself developing feelings that he thought he had buried forever. Not just gratitude, though that was certainly present, but something deeper and more complex. Admiration for this young woman who had the courage to show kindness when everyone else chose judgment. Wonder at her apparent inability to see him as anything less than fully human. And yes, if he was being honest with himself, the first stirrings of something that felt dangerously like love. The thought terrified him. What right did someone like him, homeless, broken, carrying more baggage than the cargo hold, have to feel anything romantic towards someone like Sarah? She was young, beautiful, successful, clearly good-hearted, with her whole life ahead of her. He was damaged goods, a cautionary tale, someone that people crossed the street to avoid. The gulf between them seemed insurmountable, and yet he couldn't stop himself from feeling drawn to her kindness, like a plant turning toward sunlight after months in darkness. Halfway through the flight, turbulence struck. Nothing dangerous, just the normal bumps and jolts that experienced flyers barely notice. But it was enough to wake Marcus from the first real sleep he had enjoyed in weeks. As he opened his eyes, trying to orient himself to his surroundings, he found Sarah standing beside his row, her hand gently resting on the back of his seat. She had been checking on him while he slept, making sure he was comfortable, probably adjusting his blanket or ensuring that other passengers weren't disturbing him. "Sorry," she whispered when she realized he was awake. "I didn't mean to wake you. I was just making sure you were okay." In the dim cabin lighting, with most other passengers either dozing or absorbed in their personal devices, there was an intimacy to the moment that made Marcus's heart race in a way that had nothing to do with turbulence. Here was this incredible woman, this angel in a blue uniform, watching over him like he mattered, like his well-being was important to someone in the world. "You don't need to apologize," Marcus said quietly, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. "I should thank you. I haven't slept like that in a very long time." He wanted to tell her more, to explain what her kindness meant to him, to somehow convey the magnitude of the gift she had given him simply by treating him with dignity. But the words wouldn't come. Trapped behind years of pain and self-protection, and the learned behavior of not expecting anything good from anyone. Sarah smiled, that same genuine warmth that had first caught his attention. "I'm glad you could rest. We should be landing in Atlanta in about an hour and a half. Is someone meeting you there?" It was a casual question, the kind flight attendants often asked passengers, but Marcus's face immediately clouded over. No, no one was meeting him. He had nowhere to go, no one to call, no plan beyond hoping to find a shelter with an available bed, or, failing that, a park bench that wasn't already claimed by someone else in his situation. The expression that crossed Marcus's features was so heartbreaking that Sarah immediately regretted asking the question. She could see him retreat into himself, the walls going back up, the brief moment of connection threatened by the harsh reality of his circumstances. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry. It's none of my business." But even as she said it, she found herself caring about the answer, caring about what would happen to this man when the flight ended and her ability to help him came to an end. "It's okay," Marcus replied, but his voice had lost some of its warmth. "I'll figure something out. I always do." It was both true and not true. He did always figure something out, in the sense that he was still alive, still surviving day to day. But figuring it out meant sleeping in doorways and bus stations, meant digging through trash cans for food, meant constantly moving to stay ahead of police who saw his very existence as a problem to be solved through relocation rather than assistance. The conversation might have ended there, with both of them retreating to safer emotional territory, if not for what happened next. A passenger 2 rows ahead, the businessman who had been particularly vocal about his displeasure with Marcus's presence, suddenly called out in a voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Excuse me, flight attendant, I need to speak with you about the passenger in 23C. This situation is completely unacceptable, and I demand that something be done about it immediately." Sarah's jaw tightened, but her voice remained professionally calm when she approached the man's seat. "What seems to be the problem, sir?" she asked, though she already knew exactly what he was going to say. Marcus, meanwhile, slumped lower in his seat, the brief respite from shame and judgment coming to an abrupt end. The passengers around him began to pay attention again, sensing drama and conflict, their phones once again appearing as they prepared to document whatever confrontation might unfold. "The problem," the businessman said loudly, making no effort to lower his voice or show any consideration for Marcus's feelings, "is that I paid over $400 for this ticket, and I'm being forced to sit next to someone who clearly hasn't bathed in weeks. The smell is overwhelming, and it's completely ruining my flight experience. I want him moved, or I want to be compensated for the unacceptable conditions you've subjected me to." The cabin fell silent, except for the steady hum of the engines. Every passenger within earshot was now watching to see how Sarah would respond. Would she cave to the pressure, perhaps offer to move Marcus to a different seat, or worse, somehow validate the businessman's complaints? Would she maintain professional neutrality, treating it as a simple customer service issue to be resolved through policy and procedure? What she did instead surprised everyone, including herself. Sarah stood straighter, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin as she addressed not just the businessman, but everyone who was listening. "Sir, I understand that flying can be stressful and everyone wants to be comfortable. But the passenger you're referring to has just as much right to be on this aircraft as you do. He's paid for his ticket, he's following all safety regulations, and he's been nothing but courteous since boarding. I will not ask him to move, nor will I apologize for treating him with the same respect I show every passenger." The businessman's face turned red with indignation. "This is ridiculous. I demand to speak to your supervisor. This is discrimination against paying customers who have reasonable expectations about basic hygiene and—" But Sarah held up her hand, her professionalism never wavering, even as her voice took on a steel edge that made it clear she was not going to back down. "Sir, if you continue to speak disrespectfully about another passenger, I will have to ask the captain to radio ahead for security to meet us at the gate. Everyone on this aircraft deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. That includes you, and it includes him. Now, I need to continue with my duties, but if you have any other concerns that don't involve disparaging fellow passengers, I'm happy to help." The entire exchange had taken less than 5 minutes, but it felt like a turning point, not just for Marcus and Sarah, but for everyone who witnessed it. Some passengers looked embarrassed, suddenly seeing their own behavior and attitudes reflected in the businessman's complaints. Others seemed inspired by Sarah's courage in standing up for what was right, even when it would have been easier to take the path of least resistance. Marcus sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the realization that someone, this incredible, brave woman, had just publicly defended him. When was the last time anyone had stood up for him? When was the last time someone had declared that he had rights, that he deserved respect, that his dignity mattered? The emotions that washed over him were so intense that he had to grip the armrests of his seat to steady himself. As Sarah walked back past his row, she paused and leaned down slightly. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her concern genuine and immediate. Marcus looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. In that silence, something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that went beyond the normal boundaries between passenger and crew member, between two strangers who had known each other for only a few hours. "Why?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the engine noise. "Why did you do that? You don't even know me." It was the question that had been burning inside him since she first knelt beside his seat, the question that encompassed not just her defense of him, but every kindness she had shown, every moment she had treated him like he mattered. Sarah's answer came without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for him to ask. "Because everyone deserves kindness. Everyone deserves dignity. And because—" She paused, searching for the right words to express something she was only beginning to understand herself. "Because I can see that you're a good person who's going through a hard time. And sometimes, when people are hurting, a little compassion can make all the difference in the world. If you're as moved by this act of courage as we are, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear this story." Marcus felt tears beginning to form in his eyes for the second time that day, but these were different from the tears of shame and despair that had become his constant companions. These were tears of gratitude, of hope, of something that felt dangerously like healing beginning to take root in the wasteland of his broken life. But the story was far from over. In fact, the most shocking revelation was still to come, one that would change everything the passengers thought they knew about the man they had so quickly judged and dismissed. As the plane began its descent into Atlanta, preparing for the landing that would mark the end of this extraordinary journey, fate was preparing to unveil the truth about Marcus Williams in a way that no one could have anticipated. The first hint came from an unlikely source. The college student sitting next to Marcus, who had spent most of the flight with his headphones on and his attention focused on his laptop screen, suddenly turned and looked at Marcus with an expression of dawning recognition. He had been working on a research project for his military history class, reading through articles and testimonials about Afghanistan veterans, when something caught his eye. a photograph accompanying a story about a helicopter pilot who had saved 17 wounded soldiers in a single day under heavy enemy fire. The face in the photograph was younger, cleaner, wearing a dress uniform decorated with ribbons and medals, but the eyes were unmistakable. They were the same intelligent, kind eyes that belonged to the man sitting right next to him. The college student, whose name was Jake, looked back and forth between his laptop screen and Marcus several times, his mouth slowly falling open in disbelief.
"Sir," Jake said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I think I know who you are." Marcus turned toward him with a puzzled expression, not understanding what the young man could possibly mean. But Jake was already turning his laptop screen so that Marcus could see it. And the moment Marcus glimpsed the photograph, his entire body went rigid with shock. It was him, Captain Marcus Williams, receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat operations. The article detailed how he had repeatedly flown his helicopter into a hot landing zone under intense enemy fire to evacuate wounded soldiers, making 6 trips over the course of 4 hours and refusing to leave until every wounded man had been brought to safety. The story described him as a hero whose actions embodied the very best of American military service, and included quotes from soldiers whose lives he had saved, calling him an angel with rotor blades and the bravest man I've ever known. Marcus stared at the screen, transported back to a time when he had been someone completely different. Someone respected, valued, important. Someone who had purpose and pride and the unquestioning support of his brothers and sisters in arms. The contrast between that man and who he had become was so stark that for a moment he couldn't breathe. Jake's voice brought him back to the present. "You're Captain Williams. You're the pilot who saved all those soldiers in Afghanistan. Oh my God, you're a genuine war hero." His words were louder than he intended, and despite Marcus's immediate gesture for him to keep his voice down, several nearby passengers had already heard and were turning to see what the commotion was about. The businessman who had complained so loudly earlier leaned across the aisle, his expression skeptical. "What are you talking about? That's impossible. This man is obviously homeless, probably has mental problems, definitely has hygiene issues. He can't be some decorated war hero." But Jake was already showing the laptop screen to other passengers, the photograph and article spreading from row to row like wildfire as people passed phones and tablets back and forth, comparing the image to the man sitting in 23C.
Sarah, who had been in the galley preparing for landing procedures, noticed the sudden buzz of excitement and hurried down the aisle to see what was happening. When she saw the crowd gathering around Marcus's row, her first instinct was to protect him from whatever new form of harassment might be developing. But as she got closer and saw the laptop screen that everyone was staring at, she felt her own breath catch in her throat. The photograph showed a man in military dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons and medals that spoke to extraordinary service and sacrifice. The face was unmistakably Marcus's, though younger and without the lines of pain and hardship that now marked his features. But it was the citation that really stopped her cold. The detailed account of heroism under fire, of a pilot who had risked his own life repeatedly to save others, who had been willing to fly into hell itself rather than leave wounded soldiers behind. "Marcus," she said softly, kneeling beside his seat once again, Is this you?" Her voice was filled with wonder and something that might have been awe. Marcus looked at her with an expression of pure anguish, as if his greatest shame had been exposed for everyone to see. Not the shame of being homeless or struggling, but the shame of having fallen so far from the man he used to be. "Yes," he whispered, his voice breaking on the single word. "That's who I used to be, before everything fell apart, before I lost everything that mattered." The admission seemed to take all his remaining strength, and he slumped back in his seat as if the weight of his former glory was more than he could bear. But Sarah's reaction was not what he expected. Instead of pity or condescension, her eyes filled with something that looked like fierce pride and protective anger. "You didn't lose who you are," she said firmly. "You're still that man. You're still the person who saved 17 lives. You're still a hero, Marcus. Nothing that's happened since then can change that." Her words seemed to unlock something in the other passengers as well. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Faces that had shown disgust and judgment just hours earlier now reflected shame, admiration, and a dawning understanding of how quickly they had been to condemn someone based on appearances alone. The businessman who had complained so loudly was staring at the laptop screen with an expression of horror, perhaps beginning to comprehend the magnitude of his earlier behavior. But it was what happened next that would be talked about for years to come by everyone on that flight. A voice from the back of the plane called out, clear and strong, "Thank you for your service, Captain Williams." Then another voice joined in, and another, until the entire cabin was filled with applause and expressions of gratitude that had been 18 months too late in coming, but were no less genuine for their delay. Marcus broke down completely then, tears streaming down his face as he was confronted with a level of recognition and respect that he had never expected to experience again. The emotional release was so complete that his whole body shook with the force of it, years of suppressed pain and shame and loss pouring out of him in a way that was both heartbreaking and beautiful to witness. Sarah didn't hesitate. She unbuckled his seatbelt and helped him to his feet, then did something that was probably against airline policy, but felt absolutely necessary in that moment. She wrapped her arms around him in a hug that conveyed everything she couldn't put into words. The applause grew louder, and passengers who had been covering their noses in disgust just hours earlier were now standing to show their respect for the man they had so completely misjudged. The college student, Jake, was the first to approach. "Captain Williams," he said formally, extending his hand, "I'm writing my senior thesis on helicopter pilots in Afghanistan. Would it be okay if I interview you sometime? I think people need to hear your story." Behind him, other passengers were forming a line, each wanting to shake Marcus's hand, to apologize for their earlier behavior, to express gratitude that should have been given long ago. The businessman was among them, his face red with embarrassment and genuine remorse. "Captain, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I served in the Army myself years ago. I should have known better. I should have looked beyond. I have no excuse for how I treated you. I'm ashamed of myself, and I'm sorry." Marcus, still overwhelmed by the sudden reversal in his circumstances, could only nod and accept the man's outstretched hand. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came from an unexpected source, a young mother who had been traveling with her 8-year-old daughter. The little girl had watched the entire scene unfold with the clarity that sometimes only children possess, and she walked up to Marcus with the kind of directness that adults often lose somewhere along the way to societal conditioning. "Mister," she said, looking up at him with serious eyes, "my daddy is a soldier too, and he told me that the most important thing about a person isn't what they look like on the outside, but what they have in their heart. I think you must have a really good heart to save all those people." Then, without waiting for a response, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small American flag pin, the kind that school children are given on patriotic holidays. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing it into his palm, "so you remember that you're still a hero." The gesture was so pure, so innocent of adult prejudices and complications, that it broke something open in Marcus that had been closed for far too long. He knelt down to her level, tears still streaming down his face, and pinned the little flag to his shirt with hands that trembled with emotion. "Thank you, sweetheart," he managed. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." As the plane began its final approach to Atlanta, the atmosphere in the cabin had been completely transformed. Conversations that had started with apologies evolved into genuine interest in Marcus's story, his service, and his struggles since returning home. Passengers exchanged contact information, offering help with everything from job leads to housing connections to simply a phone number to call if he needed someone to talk to. But through it all, Marcus found his attention drawn again and again to Sarah, who had moved quietly to the background as the other passengers took their turns expressing their gratitude and support. She watched it all with a smile that seemed to contain both joy at seeing Marcus finally receive the recognition he deserved, and something deeper, more personal, that she wasn't quite ready to name. When the crowd around Marcus finally began to disperse as passengers returned to their seats for landing, he made his way to the galley where Sarah was completing her pre-landing checklist. "Sarah," he said, his voice still rough with emotion, but steadier than it had been in months, "I need to tell you something. What you did today, the way you treated me, it saved my life in ways you can't possibly understand." Sarah looked up from her clipboard, her expression serious. "Marcus, you don't need to thank me for treating you like a human being. That should be the baseline, not something special." But Marcus shook his head, struggling to find words adequate to what he was feeling. "You don't understand," he said urgently. "When I got on this plane today, I was planning for this to be my last flight. I had given up completely. I couldn't see any reason to keep going, couldn't imagine things ever getting better. But you—" His voice broke again, and he had to pause to collect himself. "You reminded me that I was still worth something, that someone could still see value in me. You gave me back my humanity when I thought it was lost forever." The confession hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known Marcus was struggling, had sensed his despair and desperation, but she hadn't realized just how close to the edge he had been. The thought that her simple acts of kindness might have literally saved his life was overwhelming and humbling and terrifying all at once. "Marcus," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm, "I'm so glad you're still here. The world needs people like you in it. Those soldiers you saved, they're alive today because of your courage and skill. Your story isn't over yet. Today proved that." As the plane touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, neither Marcus nor Sarah knew what the future would hold. But they both knew that something fundamental had shifted during that flight, something that went beyond a simple act of kindness between strangers. What had started as compassion had evolved into something deeper, more complex, more meaningful. Marcus no longer felt like he was facing the world completely alone. He had been reminded of his own worth, his own heroism, his own capacity to inspire others and make a difference. The business cards and phone numbers in his pocket represented not just offers of help, but proof that people were willing to look beyond surface appearances to see the person underneath. And Sarah had discovered something about herself as well, that she was capable of a kind of courage that went beyond professional duty, that she could stand up for what was right even when it was difficult, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another person is simply to see them, really see them, and acknowledge their inherent dignity and worth. As passengers began to deplane, many stopped to speak with Marcus one more time, to offer final words of encouragement or to make concrete plans for follow-up contact. The businessman pressed a business card into Marcus's hand and insisted that he call about a job opportunity. The college student exchanged information so he could conduct his interview. The little girl and her mother promised to send letters to whatever address he ended up at. But it was Sarah's final words that Marcus would carry with him longest. As he prepared to leave the aircraft, she caught his arm and pulled him aside. "Marcus," she said, looking directly into his eyes, "I want you to know that meeting you today has changed something in me too. You've reminded me why I love what I do, why treating people with kindness and dignity matters so much. And I hope this isn't goodbye." Marcus felt his heart race at the implications of her words. Was she saying what he hoped she was saying? Was it possible that this incredible woman might actually want to continue their connection beyond this flight? "I hope so too," he said quietly. "More than you know." Sarah smiled and pressed a piece of paper into his hand. "My personal phone number," she said. "Call me when you get settled, when you're ready. I want to know how your story continues." Then, before Marcus could respond, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek gently, a gesture so full of warmth and promise that it felt like the sun coming out after months of winter. As Marcus walked off the plane and into the bustling terminal, he felt like a different person than the broken, desperate man who had boarded just 5 hours earlier. He still faced enormous challenges: finding housing, employment, rebuilding his life from virtually nothing. But he was no longer facing those challenges alone. He had been reminded of his own strength, his own worth, and his own capacity to overcome adversity. More importantly, he had found something he thought was lost forever: the possibility of love, of connection, of a future that included hope instead of just survival. The piece of paper in his pocket with Sarah's phone number felt like a lifeline, a bridge between the man he had been and the man he could become again. 6 months later, Marcus and Sarah would have their first official date, dinner at a small restaurant in Atlanta, where Marcus, now employed as a flight instructor and living in a modest apartment, would tell Sarah the full story of how he had ended up homeless and hopeless, and how her kindness had literally saved his life. She would listen with the same compassionate attention she had shown on the airplane, and when he finished, she would take his hand and tell him that she had been falling in love with him since the moment she knelt beside his seat and offered him water. The job lead in Atlanta had worked out better than Marcus could have imagined. His friend Tom Rodriguez, who owned the charter flight company, had taken one look at Marcus's condition and immediately arranged for temporary housing, clean clothes, and access to a shower before even discussing the position. "Marcus, brother, what happened to you?" Tom had asked, his voice filled with concern and confusion at seeing his former squadron mate in such dire circumstances. When Marcus finally broke down and told Tom the whole story, the failed mission, the deaths he couldn't prevent, the PTSD, the drinking, losing Jennifer and Emma, the descent into homelessness, Tom listened without judgment and then made a decision that would change Marcus's life forever. Not only did he offer Marcus a job as a flight instructor, but he also helped him find a therapist who specialized in treating combat veterans, connected him with a VA counselor who could navigate the bureaucracy more effectively than Marcus had managed alone, and even loaned him money for a security deposit on a small but clean apartment. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Marcus still struggled with nightmares, still battled the urge to drink away his pain, still felt overwhelmed by guilt over the soldiers he couldn't save and the family he had lost through his own failures. But now he had structure again, purpose, people who believed in his ability to recover and rebuild. And most importantly, he had hope. Hope that was represented by a phone number written on a piece of paper that he kept in his wallet and looked at every day, but hadn't yet found the courage to use. Sarah, meanwhile, had returned to her regular flight schedule, but she found herself thinking about Marcus constantly. She wondered if he had made it to Atlanta safely, if the job opportunity he had mentioned worked out, if he was getting the help he clearly needed. She caught herself looking for him on every flight, hoping against logic that she might see his face among the passengers boarding her aircraft. More than that, she found herself changed by their encounter in ways she was still trying to understand. The experience had awakened something in her, a deeper sense of purpose, a clearer understanding of why compassion mattered, and yes, feelings for Marcus that went far beyond sympathy or professional concern. She had replayed their conversation dozens of times, remembering the intelligence in his eyes, the dignity he maintained despite his circumstances, the way he had thanked her, as if simple human decency was an extraordinary gift. 3 months after the flight, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She requested a transfer to Delta's Atlanta hub, telling her supervisor that she wanted new challenges and opportunities for advancement. It was a plausible explanation, and the transfer was approved without question. But Sarah knew the real reason she wanted to be based in Atlanta. It was where Marcus was, and some part of her hoped that fate might bring them together again. It was on a Tuesday morning in late spring when Sarah finally saw Marcus again, and the transformation was so complete that she almost didn't recognize him. She was grabbing coffee at a small cafe near the airport when she noticed a man at a corner table reading a flight manual and making notes. Something about his posture, the way he held his head, caught her attention. When he looked up to signal the waitress for more coffee, Sarah's heart nearly stopped. It was definitely Marcus, but he looked like a completely different person. His hair was cut and neatly styled, his face was clean-shaven, and he was wearing khakis and a polo shirt that fit properly and showed no signs of wear or stains. His eyes, which had been so haunted and defeated on the airplane, now held purpose and focus. He was clearly studying, clearly working, clearly rebuilding his life in a way that Sarah found both inspiring and attractive. For several minutes, Sarah stood frozen by the cafe entrance, unsure whether she should approach him or simply be glad to see that he was doing well and leave him in peace. The decision was made for her when Marcus glanced toward the door and their eyes met across the crowded cafe. The recognition was immediate and mutual, and the smile that spread across Marcus's face was so genuine and joyful that Sarah felt her own heart racing in response. Marcus stood immediately and crossed the cafe in long strides, arriving at Sarah's side with an expression of wonder and delight that made her feel like the most important person in the world. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I can't believe. I hoped I might see you again, but I didn't dare. You look beautiful. How are you?" The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and covered everything from Marcus's recovery and new job to Sarah's transfer to Atlanta and her own journey of self-discovery since their flight together. They talked about his therapy sessions, his slowly improving relationship with his ex-wife and daughter, his growing confidence in his ability to build a stable life again. Sarah shared her own reflections on their encounter, how it had changed her perspective on her work and her understanding of what really mattered in life. When Marcus finally worked up the courage to ask Sarah if she would like to have dinner with him sometime, her response was immediate and enthusiastic. "I've been hoping you'd ask," she said, her cheeks flushing with pleasure. "I've thought about you every day since that flight." The admission was bold for Sarah, who normally guarded her emotions carefully, but there was something about Marcus that made her want to be completely honest about her feelings. Their first official date was everything Marcus had dreamed of and more. He chose the restaurant carefully, not too expensive to make Sarah uncomfortable, but nice enough to show that he was serious about treating her with the respect she deserved. They talked for hours about their hopes, their dreams, their fears, and their growing feelings for each other. Marcus told Sarah about his daughter Emma, how he was working to rebuild that relationship and hoped someday to introduce the two most important women in his life to each other. Sarah shared her own dreams of traveling the world, maybe starting a family someday, finding someone who would love her not just for who she appeared to be, but for who she really was inside. By the end of the evening, both of them knew that something special was beginning. When Marcus walked Sarah to her car, they stood talking for another hour, neither wanting the evening to end. Finally, Sarah stepped closer and looked up into his eyes with an expression of tenderness that took his breath away. "Marcus," she said softly, "I need you to know something. What I felt for you on that airplane, it wasn't pity or professional sympathy. It was recognition. I saw in you the kind of person I've been looking for my whole life. Someone with real strength, real courage, real integrity. Your circumstances didn't define you then, and they don't define you now. I'm falling in love with who you are, not what you have or don't have." The kiss that followed was soft and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Marcus rested his forehead against Sarah's and whispered, "I love you too. I think I've loved you since the moment you knelt beside my seat and treated me like I mattered." It was a declaration that sealed their fate and set them on a path toward a future neither had dared to imagine just months earlier. Their wedding would be attended by many of the passengers from Flight 447, including Jake, who would serve as best man, and Dorothy, the elderly woman who had first defended Marcus, who would give a reading about the power of love to transform lives. The little girl who gave Marcus the flag pin would be the flower girl, proudly carrying a bouquet down the aisle toward the man she still called a hero. And Robert Carlyle, the businessman who had complained so loudly, would give a speech about the importance of looking beyond appearances and the power of second chances. A speech that would move many guests to tears as he publicly apologized for his behavior and credited Marcus and Sarah with teaching him about the true meaning of dignity and worth. The ceremony would be held in a small church in Atlanta, decorated with flowers that Sarah had chosen and music that Marcus had selected from his military days. As Sarah walked down the aisle in a simple but elegant dress, Marcus would think about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from the darkest period of his life to a happiness he had never thought possible. And when they exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring, there wouldn't be a dry eye in the house. Their honeymoon would be a trip to see Emma, Marcus's daughter, who had gradually warmed to the idea of her father's new girlfriend and was excited to have a stepmother who worked on airplanes. The three of them would spend a week at the beach, building sandcastles and talking about the future. And Emma would whisper to Sarah that she was glad her daddy was happy again, and that she thought Sarah must be magic to have helped him smile so much.
If this story has touched your heart, please share it with friends and family who need to be reminded that compassion and dignity should never be conditional on someone's circumstances. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in humanity. Until next time, remember that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything.